Okay. So, tonight we're going to talk about Fritz Perls and Gestalt, and his theory has a really broad range to it. Eventually, you know, there were some additions to his more traditional theory about feelings being housed in different parts of our bodies and uh, a technique called Rolfing and all of that. We don't really have to get into any of that. I just use the traditional theory when I use Gestalt theory. Um, I never touch a client. Uh, and so I think that kind of went off into some other boundaries, that those other aspects of his theory. But the very traditional Gestalt theory we're going to talk about, and I think it's very useful. Um, so the video you're going to watch this week is Fritz Perls and Gloria, and you're going to answer the same question, you know, and uh, and we'll talk about it next week and in your discussion post. The one thing I do need to say, I mentioned this last week, is that um, I like Gestalt theory. I don't like Fritz Perls, and that's okay. So some people like him, you know. You might like an arrogant therapist that seems to know everything and hasn't addressed his own issues. That I'm not biased. So that's okay. Um, I have a couple stories that are interesting. So, um, I was in my master's program, like 1992, uh, which seems like only yesterday. But I had a lot of professors who were about to retire. It was like a whole generation of professors that had gone into counseling and psychology, and now they were about ready to retire. So they were like a previous generation of professors. A lot of them had been in World War II, Vietnam, Korea, you know, or other wars. And one of the professors I uh, had served in, the military, and I guess he had seen some pretty traumatic events. He had experienced a lot of trauma, PTSD. Um, Back then, they didn't have the same phrasing, but today we would call it PTSD with intermittent explosive disorder. And so, but back then, he went through years of therapy. And I think that, his name was Eugene Alexander. And I had him for his very last class. And by the time he had taught for 25, 30 years and gone through all those therapy, his class, was filled with like bean bags and wind chimes and it was totally experiential and he did his own thing. But you know, so he was definitely a holdover from the 60s and 70s and everybody loved it. But and he told us he shared his own story with everybody and how he, had been in the military and gotten PTSD and and he's like, and it used to be that he didn't have the term intermittent explosive disorder, but he said 99% of the time, I'm the most mild-mannered guy you'd ever want to meet. I meditate, I do the, music and everything. He was a psychologist because he had loved therapy so much. He decided to go into psychology. And he was a great therapist, very understanding. But every now and then, if somebody really rubbed him the wrong way, he said it was like flicking that light switch. And all of that hostility would explode, hence intermittent explosive disorder. So then we started talking about Gestalt therapy, and he had gone to get his doctorate out in California, and um, his roommate's girlfriend had just broken up with him, and his roommate was really depressed and sad. And Eugene was like, um, "Hey, buddy, let's go to this party, uh, and there's going to be all these famous, psychologists there." And it'd be cool to meet some of them and get your mind off your relationship woes. And so his friend went, and they go in and they enter the party, and it's like along the ocean and everything. And he's like, this is really cool. And started seeing all these people he had read about. And Fritz Perls was there. And Perls goes up. It's like a magnet. He saw that his friend was having some emotional dilemma. Of course, his girlfriend just broke up with him. And and he comes over and he starts like talking to his friend about his body language and this and that. And and Eugene's like, "Hey man, just leave my friend alone. We're here to chill out, to just meet some people, to forget about his problems. Fritz just wouldn't leave him be. And eventually Fritz, you know, flipped that light switch. And Eugene knocked him out, knocked him over the couch. All he saw were these two little feet sticking up above the couch. Uh, and they ran away because they thought they'd call the cops. So um, that's the only personal story I know about pearls. Um, I do know that one of my friends, Tom Petrone, and his wife, they run the Gestalt Institute in Pittsburgh, and I went to school with them at Duquesne. Um, if anybody really loves Gestalt, there's also one in, I think it's Cincinnati. Um, let's see if it's Cincinnati or Cleveland. Ba-ba. Cleveland. I always get those two places mixed up. So it's in Cleveland. So Tom got his training in Cleveland, and um, now he has a Gestalt Institute in Pittsburgh. Um, so I I don't know if it's in the newest version of Corey's book. I know it was in an earlier version, but in the beginning of the chapters, they have a picture of the theorist and they have a little quote from them. And so they had a picture of Fritz Perls and a little quote from him. Beside him, they had a picture of his wife, Laura Perls, and her quote was, "Without the contributions of his colleagues, friends, and myself, there would be no Gestalt theory." And of course, she outlived Fritz Perls, and she stated that quote after he died. And, but I think that's really telling that she felt the need to give herself some credit. Like earlier theorists like Erickson, he included his wife in everything. He gave her credit for all of her ideas. They were a pair, they were equal. But but I think that, his wife made some pretty good contributions to this theory and doesn't seem like she was given the credit she deserved. She held a little hostility as well. Um, and so when I was in my doctoral program, uh, we would spend like four evenings, and they would put us in a classroom and they would give us a question on 4 or 5 different areas uh, of counseling. And we didn't have any notes or books, or we couldn't prepare beforehand. We just have to write and write and write for 3 hours and then turn it in. They were our comps. And I've been teaching theories even while I was a doctoral student, and I really like theories as a master's student. And what they did for the theories exam was they showed us a video of Fritz Perls and Gloria. And they said, I guess it wasn't the theories exam, it was a supervision exam. They would say, okay, this guy is your student. What feedback would you give him if you were in supervision if you were his supervisor? Well, a lot of people hadn't seen these videos. I had seen them many times. And so it's pretty easy for us to critique that a lot of times he doesn't follow his own theory, like he doesn't apply it to himself. Um, so I think a lot of times people create theories because it's what they need in their own lives. And I think Pearl had those insights. I think his theory would have helped him, but I don't think he really incorporated it into his own life and growth and personality. Me and one of my professors, friend of mine, Adrian Tomer, we created a theory called regret therapy, and and it was only later, like years later, that I realized that, wow, we created that theory because I needed help with my own regrets, and it did help me. So it's kind of like we know, just like Rogers might say, we know what we need to help us, and we just have need some help, to work it out. And me and my friend Adrian, we talked about it and worked it out, and that process helped me to better understand what regrets were and to alleviate my personal regrets in life and to move forward in a positive direction. And then you can use what you've learned to help other people in therapy. That's why it's so good for all of us to go to therapy. By learning about ourselves, we learn to help other people. And it's impossible to help other people unless we've dealt with our own issues as well. All right, that's my stories. So let's talk a little bit about pearls. Um, so pearls was 1893 to 1970, Laura 1905 to 1990. And so Pearls was born in Berlin and lower middle class Jewish family, lot in common with other people, born in Germany or Austria who became theorists. And if he was born in 1893, he would have experienced a lot of those conflicts that everybody else experienced as well. He had different but similar experiences than the other people. Like Adler, he struggled in school quite a bit. And but Adler just kind of developed this inferiority complex and wanted to overcome it and do well, which he did. So it gave him motivation to succeed. But Pearls had a serious problem with authority figures. And he failed seventh grade 2 times and was expelled. So his problem in school was just a little different than Adler's. And Adler's theory, was all about encouragement and growth and overcoming obstacles. And in some ways, I think because Pearls has a great theory, but because he didn't really apply it to himself, he became an authority figure. And, that's not really the right direction to go. It's almost like, you know, uh, so I used to have serious problems with authority figures as well. I mean, my dad spent his life in the military. Um, when my father put us kids to bed, uh, he would do kind of military drills with his rifle to put us asleep at night. There's no stories. So, yeah, Irene.
I was gonna ask what you thought his Pearl's underlying issue was that he never solved or like addressed that you mentioned.
Yeah, so um, I think that when people have problems with authority, they feel helpless and powerless, and they want to have power. And um, so they seek that. So they become an authority, rather, authority figure. They become an authority on something, an expert on something. And part of that whole thing is control, needing control. And that way they can, you know, live up to not only other people's expectations, but receive some form of respect or control over relationships. Well, that's actually very unhealthy. And, you know, so I thought unconsciously, you know, uh, I always had problems in school with authority figures and um, until college when, you know, my professors were very caring and kind and respectful, very different than my K through 12. Um, and but, I was on this track to get a doctorate. Oh, if I get a doctorate, I'll finally feel okay about myself. I'll have that, acknowledgement that I'm okay. Uh, but when I got the doctorate, I felt no better about myself. It, I did not find any type of fulfillment at all. And it was only later when I um, worked in counseling for a few years and I was talking with a colleague and that, why isn't there any magic happening in my sessions? I'm prepared. I know my theories. I plan everything out for my clients. And they said, well, that's the problem. You're in control of your sessions. Somehow you need to give up control of your counseling sessions and see what happens. You have to make room for the unexpected events. You have to make room for those aha experiences. If you're in control, you know what's going to happen. And so it was difficult, but I started doing that. And I realized that, yeah, I knew my theories well enough that no matter what a client brought up, I could probably respond therapeutically. But I gave the control to the client. And then great things started happening with my clients. First of all, they liked me a lot better. And, I learned to laugh at myself a lot more and, admit that I don't know something. Uh, Rather, before I was in fear of being criticized or judged. And, accept my own imperfections and humanity and accept myself. And, and the next thing I learned from that was that giving up control not only helps therapy, but giving up control helps every relationship in our lives. And so it improved like relationships with my partners and later on relationships with my kids and you know so uh yeah, that was kind of a life-changing realization. So I went totally Rogers, on that. But it takes a long time, you know. It takes work. It took years to get to that point, and I'm still not there. I still have a critical inner voice every now and then. Then I have to remind myself. So yeah, I think that's his problem. So now, the only time I use doctor is when I get called to the principal's office for my kids. Hey, I'm Grafton. Oh, I'm Dr. So-and-so, the principal. I thought we were on first name basis. I'm Grafton. Dr. Eliason. Uh, Education, K through 12. Still not where it needs to be. Bringing up those old traumas, flipping that light switch. I just become more passive aggressive, not violent. All right. So let's see. See, it's fun, you know, analyzing oneself. You got to have fun with it. You got to laugh at yourself. All right. So he went through all this problem, but he did become successful. He learned that, you know, he could gain some type of respect or feeling of fulfillment by accomplishing things in his studies. So he eventually not only completed school, but received a medical degree in psychiatry. And he was in World War I, medic for the German army. And so think about that. Just like other theorists, remember what we talked about when we talked about World War I and all the trench warfare and the concussions and, traumatic brain injuries. And, remember what we said about Adler and his experiences and how Adler looked at the whole person when he was looking at, soldiers who had been wounded. And then after the war, Pearls worked with Kurt Goldstein. I'm not sure which it is, at his Institute for Brain Damaged Soldiers in Frankfurt, Germany. So we're seeing these parallels, between these early theorists. Um, you know, because anybody who went through World War One kind of was dealing with these similar, you know, uh, problems, these issues with wounded soldiers. And Pearls discovered the same thing that Adler discovered, that we needed to stress the holistic aspect of the individual, the holistic personality. And, so we talked about that with Adler, but Pearls actually named his theory that Gestalt means whole in German. So that's why the theory is named that. He later moved to Vienna, psychoanalyzed by a famous Freudian analyst, Wilhelm Reich, and supervised by Karen Horney. Um, and 1946, which was, right after World War II, came to the US, broke away from psychoanalysis. During World War during World War II, um, he did move away from Europe because he was Jewish and he escaped persecution. Um, and but then in 1946, that's the year World War II was over. And so then he came to the United States. No longer wanted to do psychoanalysis. Um, and then 6 years later, in 1952, he founded his own theory and institute, the Institute for Gestalt Therapy in New York. So he started out on the East Coast in New York, and then he moved to the West Coast, Big Sur, California. Well, that's a little bit of history about pearls. And Gestalt means holistic, whole. Um, so he does talk a lot about phenomenology and existentialism, and phenomenology focuses on the client's subjective reality. Existentialism refers to an individual's search for meaning, the idea that people are always becoming. And he believed that people should gain awareness through experience. So it doesn't matter whether a person wanted to deal with some unfinished business from the past or uh, an issue in the present. Everything was brought into the present and experienced in the session through what he would call experiments. So he called them experiments because they recreated or they created new experiences in the session so that clients could be in the present, not in the past. They could re experience or newly experience emotions in the present session so that they could be dealt with in therapy at that moment. So he doesn't call techniques techniques, he calls techniques experiments. And that's because it's based on the word experience. So when he talks about experiential, all of his therapy focuses on the here and now. Even if it talks about the past, he brings it into, well, how's that affecting you now? As you tell me that story, how do you feel now as you're sharing that story with me now? So his theory stresses awareness, thoughts, feelings, actions. Um, Sometimes people's behavior is more important than the reason they're behaving a certain way. One thing he does not do, he does not ask why. And the reason he doesn't ask a client why, like he wouldn't say, why do you think that way? Why do you think that happened? He doesn't use the word why. He he doesn't use the word why because why creates a shift from the present feeling experience to an analytical cognitive realm. And so we feel in the present, we analyze from a different cognitive perspective. And so he wants to keep us present now, feeling in the moment. So he doesn't ask why. He can ask what, who, when, how, not why. Um, and I have seen that, it's true. If you ask somebody why, they might look up and start thinking. They're no longer feeling, they're thinking. So it's a weird dynamic, but you know. So whereas Adler believed in encouragement and growth, and Rogers believed in nurturing and possibilities. Uh, Pearls believed that human nature was manipulative and humanity's way to avoid personal responsibility. So, and you'll see this in Gloria's video. He believed that confrontation is key for two reasons. First reason, to move the client to become self-supporting, to be an individual. And secondly, to move the client to reintegrate disowned parts of their personality. We'll talk about that when we talk about the layers of a person's personality. I think that Um, Rogers also believed in gentle confrontation, but he did it in a much different way. He pointed out people's incongruencies in their thought. And so he would say to Gloria, well, in one sentence, I hear you say this, like, well, you don't believe that's really moral. But in another sentence, I hear you say, but you can't help yourself. And so it's almost like pointing out these two incongruencies, um, or an incongruency between two parts of our personality, to be more specific. But Pearls is much more confrontational. And so he plays that out in a somewhat abrasive manner. Um, so I want to talk about some things that are in the book that are a little complicated. And it's the four Gestalt principles. Do not mistake these four principles for techniques or experiments. You don't use them in therapy. So, um, I think that a lot of students mistake the four Gestalt principles as something you would use in therapy. You don't. There are ways to look at life that helped him to develop his theory. So they're more like foundational in his theory. They're not something to use in therapy. So the first one's easy, holism. We have to consider all the dimensions of human functioning. Humans and nature more than the sum of their parts. How do these different aspects of a human fit together? How does their personality fit together with their physical being? How does their trauma fit into that? We have to look at a human holistically. Field theory, the second one. An organism must be seen within the context of its ever-changing environment. Everything's related, everything's in process. Uh, so it's almost like placing the individual in context. A good example might be family or a soldier. What's their environment? You know, so, environment is important. We react in an environment. Not only does an environment influence us, but we influence our environments. All right. So number three, the figure formation process. How do individuals organize their environment? And I would say he takes it to a deeper level than just environment because he uses the same concept to help people deal with unfinished business from the past. So, figure formation process. Imagine, I put them in the notes, but imagine you've all probably seen um, a black and white picture of a white face if you look at it one way, and if you look at it another way, it's two black faces facing each other. So one way it looks like a vase, another way it looks like two faces looking at each other. So figure formation or figure ground pictures. And remember, you're not going to show a client a picture. This is about how his theory was formed. So if you think about it, we all have a past. We all have something we haven't dealt with from our past, unfinished business, he would call it. But, we move on. We deal with daily life, what's going on today in our lives. But somewhere in the back of our minds, there's still some unfinished business that might be influencing how we interact with our environment. So we might see the white vase or cup first. That's what's on our minds right now in the present. However, and the black background is just not what we're focusing on. But he would see that background as unfinished business from the past. And he would create an experiment to do with us, like a role play or something like that in the session. And it would shift the focus of that figure ground picture. And the two faces, the black background would come to the forefront, and the white vase or cup would become the background. And so he's drawing out the background, the unfinished business from our past through experiments into the present. And it shifts our focus to the two faces, to what was once the background. So experiments can shift our focus to perhaps unfinished business. So sometimes this unfinished business can be brought up unexpectedly in our life, and it can influence us in a negative way. So we might react to something or somebody because today we'd use the word triggered, you know, but something would remind us. All right. So the last one, number 4, organismic self-regulation. Don't misspell that. If a new focus or need emerges, one's equilibrium is disturbed. So let's say an experiment occurs. That unfinished business now becomes the focus. That creates anxiety because, oh, now I've got to deal with this memory, this unfinished business that I've never dealt with from the past, but now it's in the present. And I'm feeling all of those connected emotions in the present session. And it creates a disequilibrium, anxiety. Before, it was left in the background. We had some form of homeostasis or balance to our emotions, at least most of the time. All right. So those are the 4 Gestalt principles. So I mentioned unfinished business. So let's talk about unfinished business. In order to deal with aspects of the past, they're brought into the present through experiments. Unfinished business is feelings from the past which have been suppressed. They need to be dealt with in therapy in the present, or it'll affect our equilibrium. Unfinished business can be expressed in the body through psychosomatic symptoms. So remember, psycho, mind, soma, body. So we might have upset stomachs, or we might not be able to sleep, or we might get headaches, or we might have stress, tension. So often these things, this unfinished business plays out in our body. He believes that at some point in people's lives, we tend to get stuck. And, for many different reasons. But at some point, we may feel like we're no longer self-supporting. We need help. And we often deny our true selves as a result of that. So my favorite part of his theory is the 5 layers of the personality. And so the first layer is the phony layer. And you'll see in the video, Fritz says, "Oh, Gloria, you're being phony. You're a phony." Well, that's a little insulting, but, I would just do it differently. I'd explain the layer of the personality. I say, this is the phony layer. This is, and it's about playing games. But so one thing I do, so I'll explain a Gestalt experiment that I use all the time. So I have, if I had more money, I would buy like masks that people could paint and draw on and use markers on. And but I just draw masks on pieces of paper and cut out the eyes, cut out the mask. So I give them two paper masks on white paper. And on one mask, I ask them to draw the self that they show the world, the self that they've become to be accepted by others. And that could mean anything, you know? Do you belong to a certain clique? Do you want to fit in? Do you want certain friends? Do you feel like you have to look or act or do certain things for a significant other or to be liked or accepted or for your parents or guardians or for school, for teachers, for whatever, you know? And, people will draw on the mask or write things on the mask of all the different ways that they've changed throughout their lives to be accepted. And it's quite a bit when we begin to think about it. I mean, everything from the way we dress to working out to, living in a certain area. It's endless. Driving a certain kind of car, getting a certain kind of degree, you know, listening to certain kinds of music, whatever it might be, playing a certain sport. Um, yeah, it's endless. And then I say, okay, on this other piece of paper, I want you to think about the person you don't show the world because you're afraid they'll reject that person. Who's the real you without all those changes? Who's the true you, the genuine you? What are some things that you like that you might not show the world for fear of being rejected? That's a little harder for them to come up with because it's been hidden for so long. Their genuine self has been hidden even from them. They think, oh, this is who I am. No, that's not really who you are. And so then we stand in front of a mirror and I have them put on the first mask and look at themselves in the mirror and read what's on the mask and talk about what's on the mask. And then I have them remove that mask and I have them to put on the genuine mask and talk about that. And we talk about the feelings that they feel with each mask. And there's drastically different feelings, but there's usually a feeling of sadness because, they are not expressing their true selves. They're hiding their true selves. And there's like this aha moment when, you know, they're like, wow, I don't want to be the fake me anymore. I want to be accepted for who I am. And they realize the next layer of the personalities, which is the phobic layer, that they created everything on that first mask to avoid the emotional pain of rejection. And eventually they incorporated into themselves and they placed expectations upon themselves. And they didn't even accept themselves unless they met certain conditions. And so that's awareness of the phobic layer, the fear of rejection, and the catalyst for all of those changes that took place. The next one is we can use a different experiment and talk about some different areas where they might have gotten stuck, where this belief, this fear got solidified, maybe when they felt they heard disappointment in a parent's voice, or when first partner broke up with them, or, you know, uh, a teacher gave them a bad grade, or they felt criticized by people they thought were friends and were no longer accepted into a peer group, whatever it might be. So there are points of stuckness that they'll remember, and we bring that into the present and they experience those feelings. But this isn't just a downer, you know. I was kind of angry when I experienced those emotions. I wasn't sad that I was rejected. I was angry that they didn't accept me and that I changed just for them. And that sometimes that anger is good. And then that anger turns into regret about time lost. But it eventually leads to a realization that we all have to go through this growth experience in order to become genuine once again. And then we get excited because, wow, I'm no longer going to care about people, whether they accept me or not. If they accept me for who I am, great. If not, that's about them. So we start thinking all of these things and we begin to get excited. Like, what would I do differently now that I want to be me? And that leads to the implosive layer. And we exposed all of the facades and defenses, and we're getting in touch with our deadness. And finally, we begin to live genuinely as who we are. And we have real life because we live with fullness and excitement because that's, wow, I get to be me finally. And I'm not held down by other people's expectations or conditions. And I can genuinely say, hey, I don't really care. And so that's the explosive layer. And that's where we want to get to. And Pearls would talk about all of these five layers of the personality like an onion you would buy in the supermarket. You pick out an onion and it's got that dead, brittle outer brown skin, and that's the phony layer. And he would say that if we're not living our true selves as our true selves, we're dead. Why live a fake life? Are you really living or are you just pretending to live? You're obviously not happy. And then we peel away that layer through experiments. And the next layer is brown but not crackly. It's still dead. And that's the phobic layer. And then we peel away that layer and we get to the impasse, that middle layer of onion skin. And we peel away that and it's green. And that's the implosive. We're beginning to live inside. Then we peel away that and we have that fresh onion. And it's potent and it smells and it makes us cry. And that's the explosive layer. Any questions about the layers of the personality? All right, so we also have, so just like Freud had defense mechanisms, Gush Pearls called them resistances to contact. And by that he means having contact between me as a genuine person, the real me, and the real you. It's very existential phenomenological. It's kind of like Buber. It's the I thou experience. It's contact between two genuine human beings. And he says we have resistances to that. Why? Because we build walls when we're rejected. We don't want to experience that pain again. And so we want to defend our emotions. So we build this wall and, oh, nobody's going to hurt us again. We're not going to be vulnerable. We're not going to trust. And yeah, we're feeling pretty good, but not great because not only are we protected against pain, but as long as that love is there, we don't allow ourselves to take a risk and become vulnerable. And without that vulnerability and trust, we cannot love either. So we can't fully love if we don't risk pain and rejection. So my personal theory is that so many therapists and clients say, oh, I want to be a better person. I want to become the person I was meant to be. I think that's totally wrong. I think we were born perfect. We were born the people we were meant to be. But as we experienced all the negativity of society and family and rejection and everything else, we changed ourselves and became phony and less genuine and put up these walls and barriers. And so counseling doesn't help us to become someone better. It takes away all of those fake layers that we've built up. It empties all that baggage that we've been carrying around, and it lets us get back to the true selves we originally were. It's a little different. All right. Resistances to contact, introjection, simply uncritically accepting the beliefs of others without assimilation, without questioning. Projection, never define a word by itself. Projection is not when we project. Projection, not owning aspects of oneself, but placing them onto others. So we never define a word by itself. So this results in not taking personal responsibility for our own feelings or true self. Retroflexion. This has two parts. Doing to oneself what one would like to do to others, like hurting oneself when somebody would actually like to hurt somebody else, or hugging oneself, self-soothing activity when somebody needs a hug, or what one would like others to do to us. Deflection, the use of distractions like humor, class clown, so that people don't see who we truly are. Confluence, a blurring of differentiation between the self and others. It's like being a human chameleon, what we do to fit in. It's like, all right, so let's talk a little bit about Gestalt experiments, what we would call techniques, he would call experiments. And there are some listed here, and you're going to go through the notes if you don't watch this lecture and use some of them in your exam that I tell you not to. So, I statements. I like I statements, but don't use it in the exam. It's too simple. When you watch the news and somebody's experienced some type of trauma, maybe a fire or an earthquake or something like that, what was this like? Well, when you experience something so horrific, you kind of feel stunned. So they answer with the word you instead of I. What that does, it pushes ownership of the experience away from self. But in order to deal with it therapeutically, we have to say I. We have to own the belief, the thought, the experience. So when I experience such a trauma, like this horrific event, I felt stunned. So sometimes I ask the clients to use I statements, but it's too simple for this exam. It's good for therapy, not good for the exam. Metaphors and narratives. Um, yeah. So like I had a client who was about 12-year-old female, lived with her dad after her mom passed away. They got along great. Eventually, the father met somebody, got married, and daughter did not get along with the new stepmom, arguing and everything else. And so they came to see me, and I asked the daughter, I said, "Hey, is there anything like a movie or a comic book or anything that kind of reminds you of your situation?" She thought about it and she's like, "Yeah, I feel just like Cinderella." And I'll tell you how I treated that when we talk about narrative therapy, but that's a metaphor. And, you know, and a narrative is a story. Body language, you'll see a good example of this when uh, Gloria is shaking her foot nervously, and Pearl says, "What are you doing with your foot?" And you'll see that interaction. Sometimes I would say, "Can you exaggerate that?" Or my favorite one is, if your foot or hand or whatever you're doing could talk, what would it be saying right now? And of course, people move their foot or tap or whatever when they're experiencing anxiety or nervousness. And so, oh, well, if my hand could talk, it would say, "I'm very nervous right now. I don't feel comfortable." Um, so that's a combination of body language and projection. So it's not the resistance projection, it's personal projection onto something. A lot of people like the empty chair technique. I don't. I find that people have a very difficult time pretending somebody is sitting in an empty chair. And so what I do, I usually use a role play. And I say, well, imagine, I'm whoever. But more importantly, I kind of combine top dog, underdog, or two aspects of their personality. And I say, imagine I am your anxiety. Just call me anxiety. And you're you. Talk to me. Talk to your anxiety. And then we'll actually get up and change places. And I say, now you're your anxiety and I'm you. What would your anxiety say? How would they respond to that? And we actually do that a number of times. It's important to actually switch seats, to verbalize it out loud. It's very different than thinking. Verbalization uses a different part of the brain. So it not only uses the part of the brain that speaks, it uses the part of the brain that hears. So it's multi-layered. That's why it's important to say things out loud. Top dog, underdog, dominant, non-dominant parts of the personality. This might change, but you can have a conversation between the two parts of the personality. The one thing you should not do is if somebody has some if somebody has some anger or unfinished business with another person, it does no good to express anger in a role play. That's just venting. It does more good to talk about, "Oh, I feel this way as a result of that unfinished business." So talk about how that affected me, the two parts of me now, the struggle I'm feeling within. Because the only person I have control over is me. So, for instance, in the exam, there's going to be a kind of a unhealthy dad in the exam. Don't talk to the dad in a role play. Have the client talk to himself. Role reversals. That's the example of, okay, talk to your anxiety. Now we're going to get up and switch places. And now you're your anxiety. So we actually reverse roles in the role play. Exaggeration, rehearsal, um, staying with the feeling. That's so important, but don't use it for the exam. It's too easy to say we're going to stay with the feeling. The problem is in counseling, counselors get to a deeper emotion, hopefully. They're like, oh, we got to the deeper emotion. But the counselor is also uncomfortable with that deeper emotion and they don't know what to do with it. So they go back up. They talk about it from a safe place. No, stay with that deeper emotion. Stay in those depths. All right. And most importantly, don't do any of these experiments at the beginning of a session because, I mean, don't do any of these at the end of a session. Do them at the beginning because they bring up emotions and you need time to process these emotions with your client. So do them, not at the end of a session. Have time to process them. All right. That is Gestalt. Questions, comments.
Yeah, I have a comment.
Okay.
Yeah, I really like the theory, and I see now how it can apply to group therapy because that's the other class that I'm taking. And when you mentioned about confluence, and how, it causes people to sort of merge their emotions, I can see that in group therapy where you find people having difficulty expressing their personal opinions, or maybe over-identifying with somebody else's opinion, or not being able to even set their boundaries. And as we were doing our practice group therapy sessions, I could, you can actually see those dynamics playing out in real life. So I think that's quite interesting.
It is. Wait till you see it with friends and family. What else?
I just wanted to say that I like the fact that there is so many techniques and experiences because or experiences, experiments, sorry. Just because I don't know, being new into the whole counseling thing, we're all still learning and these are actually helpful things. I didn't realize there was so much that you could do in a session.
Yeah.
You could
There's books like 100 Gestalt experiments.
yeah, I didn't realize that. It's kind of nice to have all of these ideas.
Yeah, here's the problem. You can't just use an experiment. You have to root it in a Gestalt therapy. And you have to, so it's not just an experiment. So if I'm using, oh, I'm running a group. Hey, oh, let me grab this Gestalt experiment from my bag of techniques and use it. You can't do that. It's got to be part of the context. And that's the mistake early, most therapists, period, use. They don't know enough about Gestalt therapy, but they love the huge number of techniques. So it's great, I agree, but use them appropriately. Don't just throw them into a session. What else? All right, I'm going to stick around in case anybody wants to talk about presentations or questions or anything.